They were men America didn't want in its cockpits, pilots Japan believed would never have the courage to fight. But when the skies over Tokyo filled with fire, when the proud empire of Japan watched its cities burn, they learned a harsh lesson about underestimating the warriors they had mocked. This is the story of how black pilots proved their mettle in the most devastating air campaign of World War II, how courage doesn't see color, how heroism transcends prejudice, and how the men who weren't supposed to fly became the terror of the Pacific skies. In 1941, the United States Army Air Forces had a policy as rigid as it was racist. Black men could not be pilots. They could serve as cooks, as janitors, as laborers, but never as the knights of the sky. The cockpit of an American warplane was considered hallowed ground, reserved exclusively for white men. The military's own studies, conducted with the explicit purpose of justifying segregation, claimed that black Americans lacked the intelligence, reflexes, and courage needed to fly combat aircraft. These weren't just casual opinions, they were official military doctrine enshrined in reports with government seals. Lieutenant Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. remembered the sting of those reports all too well. The son of the Army's first black general, Davis had graduated from West Point in 1936. Enduring 4 years during which not a single fellow cadet spoke to him, except on official business. "I was isolated like a disease," Davis would later recall, his voice never betraying the hurt those years had caused. Yet here he stood in 1941, a black officer determined to lead black men into the sky. The Japanese, meanwhile, were paying attention to America's racial divisions. Their propaganda specifically targeted black Americans, questioning why they would fight for a country that treated them as second-class citizens. Radio Tokyo broadcast messages directly to black soldiers. Why fight for a nation that lynches you, that segregates you, that denies you basic rights? Your real enemies aren't the Japanese, they're the white Americans standing next to you. These broadcasts weren't just idle chatter, they were part of a calculated psychological warfare campaign. Japanese intelligence had studied America's racial fault lines and believed they could be exploited as a critical weakness. In their military assessments, they dismissed the possibility of effective black combat units, echoing the same prejudices as their American counterparts. One captured Japanese intelligence document described black pilots as mentally inferior, lacking the reflexes and courage to engage in aerial combat. But even as these assessments circulated through Tokyo's war ministries, a revolution was taking place in the skies over Alabama. At Tuskegee Army Airfield, the first black military pilots in American history were proving every racist assumption wrong. The training was intentionally harsher than at white flight schools. The slightest infraction could get a cadet washed out. The message was clear. Black pilots had to be not just equal to white pilots, but better, much better. Charles McGee was one of those cadets, a young man whose calm demeanor masked an inner fire. "We knew we were being watched," he would later recall. "We knew that if we failed, it wouldn't just be us failing, it would be used as proof that black men couldn't fly." The pressure was immense, but so was the determination. When the first class of Tuskegee Airmen earned their wings in March 1942, they weren't just becoming pilots, they were becoming pioneers. As America reeled from the shock of Pearl Harbor and the war in the Pacific intensified, the newly formed 332nd Fighter Group, the famed Red Tails, expected to be sent to fight the Japanese. Many of the pilots felt a special motivation to confront an enemy that had specifically mocked them in propaganda. But the military brass had other plans. The 332nd was shipped to the Mediterranean theater, escorting bombers over Europe and battling the Luftwaffe rather than Japanese Zeros. But not all black pilots would miss the Pacific War. In the shadows of the more famous Tuskegee program, other black aviators were being trained for different roles as bomber crews, as transport pilots in reconnaissance aircraft. And as the war against Japan entered its most destructive phase, some of these men would find themselves at the heart of the firestorm. Lieutenant Robert Madison was one such pilot, trained as a B-25 Mitchell bomber pilot. Madison was initially relegated to training flights and coastal patrol busy work to keep black aircrews away from combat. "We called it flying in circles," Madison would later say with a bitter laugh. "They gave us planes but not permission to really use them." But as American casualties mounted in the Pacific and the demand for trained aircrews grew desperate, the color barrier began to crack. By 1944, the strategic bombing campaign against Japan was intensifying. Major General Curtis LeMay, commander of the 21 Bomber Command based in the Mariana Islands, was frustrated by the ineffectiveness of high-altitude precision bombing against Japanese targets. The jet stream, unknown to American planners before the war, scattered bombs miles from their targets, and Japan's dispersed industrial base proved resilient against conventional attacks. LeMay, a hard-bitten, cigar-chomping tactician, made a fateful decision that would transform the air war and inadvertently create an opportunity for black airmen to prove themselves against Japan. He ordered his B-29 Superfortress bombers to strip out most of their defensive guns, load up with incendiary bombs, and attack at night from low altitude. The target would not be individual factories, but entire Japanese cities, built largely of wood and paper, perfect kindling for a firestorm. It was a controversial strategy, blurring the line between military and civilian targets. But LeMay was unapologetic. The entire national structure of Japan was a legitimate military target, he would later insist. There are no civilians in Japan. As this new, more brutal air campaign ramped up, the military's desperate need for trained air crews finally overcame its commitment to segregation, at least partially. Several black bomber, cruise, transport squadrons, and reconnaissance units were assigned to Pacific airfields. Though still segregated and often given the most dangerous missions or the oldest, most trouble-prone aircraft, Madison's squadron was among them, arriving at Northfield on Tinian in February 1945. The reception from white air crews was chilly at best, hostile at worst. They gave us the worst barracks farthest from the mess hall, remembered flight engineer Samuel Brooks. And there were some who said right to our faces that they didn't think we had what it took to fly combat missions against the Japanese. Japanese propaganda quickly took note of the black air crews broadcasting taunts over Radio Tokyo. Black pilots? America must be truly desperate to put jungle savages in their cockpits. These untermenschen will flee at the first sight of our brave kamikaze warriors. Madison's crew heard these broadcasts and simmered with anger. They thought being called savages would hurt our feelings, Madison later recalled with a grim chuckle. What they didn't understand was that we'd been hearing that kind of talk our whole lives from our own countrymen. Japanese propaganda couldn't hurt us any more than we'd already been hurt. Their first mission came on March 9, 1945, a date that would become infamous in the history of aerial warfare. The target was Tokyo itself, the heart of the Japanese Empire. Over 300 B-29s would attack at low altitude under cover of darkness, carrying new M69 incendiary bombs designed to create unstoppable fires in Japan's wooden cities. As Madison's crew prepared for takeoff, a white bombardier from another plane walked past and sneered. "Try not to get lost on the way there, boys. Tokyo's that way." He pointed west with a mocking smile. Madison said nothing, simply nodded to his navigator, Lieutenant Wilson Green, who patted the stack of charts he had memorized down to the smallest detail. The flight to Tokyo took 7 hours, the B-29s plowing through the night sky at 5,000 feet. Much lower than normal bombing altitude, but LeMay's new strategy demanded it. As they approached the Japanese coast, anti-aircraft fire began to pepper the darkness around them. Searchlights swept the sky, seeking targets for Japanese fighters. "Steady," Madison told his crew over the intercom, his voice calm despite the chaos erupting around them. "Remember your training. We belong up here just as much as anyone else." As they crossed into Tokyo airspace, the lead bombers had already begun their attack runs. The first incendiaries were finding their marks. Small points of light in the darkened city, rapidly expanding into larger conflagrations. By the time Madison's B-29 reached its initial point, parts of Tokyo were already burning fiercely. Coming up on the target, called out Green, the navigator. 3 minutes to bomb release. Madison held the bomber steady as flak bursts blossomed around them, jarring the aircraft. A Japanese Zero flashed past their right wing, guns blazing, but the fighter was moving too fast to aim properly. Madison didn't flinch, keeping the bomber on its precise course. "Bombs away," called the bombardier as their payload of incendiaries fell toward the city below. What happened next would haunt the memories of every airman who flew that mission. The individual fires, fed by high winds, began to merge and grow, creating a self-sustaining firestorm of unprecedented intensity. The updrafts were so powerful they tossed the heavy B-29s like toys. Madison had to fight the controls as their bomber was lifted hundreds of feet by a thermal column of superheated air. "My God," whispered the tail gunner, watching the inferno spread below them. "The whole city is burning." He wasn't exaggerating. That night, Operation Meetinghouse, as the mission was codenamed, became the single most destructive bombing raid in human history. 15 square miles of Tokyo burned. The firestorm generated temperatures of 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. Streets melted. Metal twisted. Humans who weren't incinerated suffocated as the fires consumed the oxygen. When dawn broke over Tokyo, more than 100,000 people lay dead, with another million homeless. The heart of the Japanese Empire had been gutted in a single night. As Madison's crew returned to Tinian, exhausted and shaken by what they had witnessed, they were met not with the usual cold shoulder, but with a new kind of silence, a silence born of grudging respect. The white flight crews who had mocked them the day before now simply nodded as they walked past. No one questioned their courage anymore. Radio Tokyo's propaganda broadcasts changed noticeably in the days that followed. The explicit racial taunting disappeared, replaced by generic denunciations of American barbarity. The Japanese military, however, took more concrete action. Surviving documents show that after the March 9th raid, Japanese fighter commanders were explicitly ordered to target any bomber crews identified as Negro on the assumption that they would be less experienced and more vulnerable. This targeting had the opposite effect than intended. Black bomber crews, aware they were being singled out, became some of the most disciplined and formidable units in the air campaign. Madison's crew flew 17 more missions over Japan, including the devastating firebombing raids on Nagoya, Osaka, and Kobe. Their B-29, which they named Double Victory, referencing the campaign for victory against fascism abroad and racism at home, became one of the most reliable aircraft in the squadron, with a maintenance record that was the envy of white crews. "We couldn't afford to make mistakes," Madison explained years later. "We knew if our plane went down due to mechanical failure, they'd blame it on our maintenance, not on the fact that we often got the oldest aircraft with the most flight hours. So our ground crew worked miracles, and we flew by the book every time." The firebombing campaign continued through the spring and summer of 1945, systematically reducing Japan's cities to ash. By August, 67 Japanese cities had been partially or completely destroyed. The devastation was so complete that American planners were running out of significant targets to bomb. Through it all, black air crews continued to serve with distinction, though their stories remained largely untold in contemporary press accounts. Stars and Stripes, the military newspaper, occasionally mentioned Negro airmen in the Pacific Theater, but rarely with the same detailed coverage given to white units. When Life magazine published a special issue on the air war against Japan in July 1945, black air crews were entirely absent from its pages. This erasure cut deeply. "We were good enough to die over Tokyo," Flight Engineer Brooks would later say, "but not good enough to get our pictures in the magazines back home." The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 finally brought Japan to surrender. As American occupation forces moved into the defeated nation, interesting discoveries were made. Japanese intelligence files revealed extensive analysis of American aircrews, including specific sections on black aviators. What had begun as dismissive assessments had evolved over time into grudging respect. One document, dated July 1945, noted, "Negro bomber crews display exceptional discipline and precision. Recommend fighters concentrate on other targets." For the black airmen who had served in the Pacific, homecoming brought mixed emotions. They returned to a United States still firmly in the grip of Jim Crow's segregation. Madison, now a captain with a Distinguished Flying Cross, was refused service at a coffee shop in California while still in uniform. In Alabama, Technical Sergeant William Brown, who had survived 25 missions over Japan, was beaten by police for drinking from a whites-only water fountain. The bitter irony wasn't lost on them. They had helped burn Japanese cities to defeat an enemy that had mocked them for their race, only to return to a country that still treated them as second-class citizens. Yet their service had planted seeds of change. In 1948, President Harry Truman signed Executive Order 9981, officially desegregating the U.S. Armed Forces, a decision influenced by the undeniable contributions of black service members during the war. The Air Force, established as a separate branch in 1947, would become one of the first institutions in American society to meaningfully integrate. For Lieutenant Robert Madison, who had watched Tokyo burn beneath his bomber, the journey came full circle in 1953, now serving in the Integrated Air Force. He was stationed at Yokota Air Base near Tokyo on a free weekend. He visited the Japanese capital, largely rebuilt after the devastation of 1945. In a small restaurant, an elderly Japanese man noticed Madison's American uniform and approached his table. Madison tensed, unsure what to expect. The man bowed slightly and asked, in halting English, "You were pilot during war?" Madison nodded cautiously. "B-29?" the man asked. Another nod. The old man was quiet for a moment, then said something that Madison would never forget. "You burned our city. But all fire same color, ni. Fire not white, not black. Just fire." He bowed again and returned to his seat. Madison sat stunned. In those simple words, the old Japanese man had crystallized a truth that transcended the hatred and prejudice of both their societies. In the crucible of war, in the literal fire that had consumed Tokyo, the artificial barriers of race had been momentarily burned away, revealing the common humanity beneath. The black airmen who flew against Japan never sought to destroy cities. Like their white counterparts, they were soldiers following orders in a brutal war. What they sought was something more personal, the chance to prove that courage, skill, and determination knew no color line. In the skies over burning Japanese cities, they proved it beyond any doubt. Their story remained largely untold for decades after the war. While the Tuskegee Airmen eventually gained recognition for their service in Europe, the black bomber crews of the Pacific Theater faded into obscurity. It wasn't until the 1990s, when military historians began interviewing aging veterans for oral history projects, that their contributions began to receive proper acknowledgement. Captain Robert Madison passed away in 2006, one of the last survivors of the black bomber crews who had flown against Japan. At his funeral, a Japanese-American Air Force officer placed a small origami crane on his casket, a symbol of peace rising from the ashes of war. Madison's navigator, Wilson Green, lived until 2011, long enough to see Barack Obama elected as America's first black president. When asked by a reporter if he ever thought he'd see such a day, the old navigator smiled. "After you've seen Tokyo burn," he said, "you'll learn not to say anything is impossible." The men who weren't supposed to fly became the pilots who helped bring an empire to its knees. The men Japan had mocked in racist propaganda became the airmen they feared most. The men America had relegated to second-class citizenship became heroes whose courage helped change their nation, even if that change came too slowly and at too high a cost. In military museums across America, their story is finally being told. In the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio, a small display case holds Madison's flight jacket and the bombardier's log from the March 9, 1945 mission over Tokyo. Beside it is a quote from his last interview, given just months before his death. "We didn't fight for glory. We didn't even fight for recognition. We fought because it was right, because freedom is everyone's cause. And because we knew that in the air, proving ourselves equal, we were also fighting for dignity at home." Japan learned not to laugh at black pilots. America learned the same lesson, though it took longer. Some lessons can only be taught in fire. If this story moved you, please take a second to like this video. It truly helps us keep these untold stories alive. The black airmen who flew against Japan deserve to be remembered, not just as footnotes in history books, but as the pioneers and heroes they truly were. Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel to discover more real stories of black heroes whose courage changed the course of history. Their sacrifices deserve to be honored, their achievements celebrated, and their legacy preserved for generations to come.